I used to think the world was nailed together, like the crates my father stacked in the bakery storeroom. If something creaked, you could smack it with the heel of your hand and it would settle again. If a table wobbled, you folded a scrap of newspaper and shoved it under the short leg. If the wind got rowdy down Columbus Avenue and rattled our windows, you pressed your palm to the glass and felt the drum, and the glass remembered itself and stayed put. But that morning, before the birds were awake and before any newspaper boys had taken their noisiness to the corner by the saloon, the nails came out. The world had a short leg, a cracked beam, a loose screw, all of it at once, and I didn't have the right newspaper to wedge beneath it. I was 11 years old, and what I'm telling you is the truth as my body remembers it, even if I didn't have the words then. Some things you know in your bones before you know them in your head. We lived over my father's bakery on a sloping street that carried the smell of yeast and horse urine and sea air up from the piers, a mixture that, if you were born to it, told you everything you needed to know about where you were. The rooms had thin walls, and the downstairs oven kept us warm even when the fog rolled over Russian Hill and the windows sweated. My father slept in his undershirt by the back door in the warmest corner, because bakers do not sleep the way other people sleep. They chase the dough through the small hours, coax it to rise, and make 1,000 small rescues from too much heat or not enough air. I slept with my little sister in the room with the window that shook when trolleys passed and the wires outside sang in the wind. My mother kept a ceramic pot on the mantel like a small, ugly baby, wrapped in a scrap of muslin and tied with string. That pot was our starter, our mother, my father called it, and every morning before dawn he cracked the muslin open and fed her with flour and water, just as careful as if it were a live thing, which, he said, it was. If I have to tell you the exact time, I can. The clock over the bakery window had a face painted with Roman numerals, and I could see it from my bed if I craned my neck just so. But I didn't look at it that morning, because time didn't wear numbers then. It wore a muscle spasm. It wore a train running under the bed. It wore a sound like a wagon load of dishes being poured down a flight of stairs that never ended. The world went loose and buckled, and the wall over my head gave a cough that sent plaster dust into my mouth, and my sister sat up and screamed once and then lost her breath in wobbling silence. My mother threw the quilt off and was somehow immediately in the doorway, suddenly a soldier, her hair already braided and her jaw set, and she was lifting my sister off the bed like she weighed nothing, and she was calling for my father, who answered from the stairwell, a short, torn sound, and then the house itself rolled. I gripped the side of the mattress and the bed went across the floor, taking me with it as meek as a puppy, and the wardrobe walked out from the wall and then, as if it had second thoughts, leaned and spat a drawer into the middle of the room. The glass of the window bent like it was made of dough, and for half a heartbeat I could see the street through a warped fish bowl, Mr. Sullivan's shop front across the way stretching tall and thin and then short and fat. Horses screamed. It's a sound that has you in it because you are an animal too. My father got the door open and the stairs fell into each other like bad cards. He jumped the last 3 and landed wrong and winced, but then he was up, and he grabbed my shoulder and pushed, which in our house meant not so much go as we are going, and we went, down the twisting, groaning narrowness of the stairwell, our bare feet slapping, with the banister twitching like a live eel under my hand, my mother behind me with my sister clutched tight and my sister's feet leaving dusty commas on the front of my mother's nightdress. The floor shivered like cold skin. The lamp swung and smashed. The oven made a noise like a cough in a giant's chest. Outside, the street had become a fairground of surprises. The cobbles rippled. The telegraph poles leaned into each other like drunks and then sprang apart. Laundry swung from balcony to balcony and wrung itself out. Windows spat glass, and the glass came down glittering in the scant light, in long, bright sighs, the way a line of soldiers breathe together when they lower their muskets in a parade. Men in their undershirts stood in doorways with their mouths open. A woman who kept a parrot had the bird on her shoulder and it said, over the roar inside the roar, now, 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 which made no sense and perfect sense at once. My body made the decision to sit down hard in the gutter because the ground wasn't to be trusted. I remember the cold, dirty water against my thighs and the taste of lime and old tobacco leaping into my mouth. I must have licked my teeth in fright. When the first part of the shaking ended, the whole city took a breath like after a long sob, and then a second wave came, different, more rolling, as if we had moved from the top of the sheet to the middle, and now we were being held by someone trying to pull the sheet straight. We could hear things failing away off, a sound that didn't belong to our street. The breath in our chest learned a new rhythm that morning, a waiting then a spasm then another waiting, and even when you'd swear the earth was finished, you braced, because your bones knew there was more. It stopped the way the wayward wheel of a handcart slows after bumping along, not all at once but in shivers and then in faint tremors you think you might be imagining. A figure ran past with one boot and one bare foot. A horse stood with its legs splayed wide like a colt and sat down suddenly, tail first, looking astonished at itself. The parrot said nothing. I remember wishing it would, so the world would seem regular again. My father went still, his hand on my shoulder, his mouth set. Then he looked at his hands, probably to see if they were shaking, and then he looked behind us, at the bakery. People tell you later that there were 1,000 smells, but at first there was only one, and it was the inside of a stone broken open. Rock smell. Dust that was old before we were born. That, and the faint lightsome sweetness of the yeast that lived in the corner downstairs, which hand to heart, if I live 100 years, I will be able to call up from nowhere. My father's face went the way it goes when he sees a mistake in a loaf not yet in the oven. The oven was still warm, because it is always warm. He said, the mother, to no one. My mother said, Antonio, don't, as if any of us could keep him, and he raised his chin and made the decision that fathers make in crises, to split into more men than one, which is magic. He went into the bakery. I pressed my lips together so I wouldn't call after him. My mother adjusted her hold on my sister and put a hand on my head. Mr. Sullivan crossed himself and went into his shop to look for his ledger, because some men cannot be separated from their numbers even by God's own shaking. There was a run of footsteps down the block, and then a smell came, not from the bakery but from the world, and if the dust smell had been older than the city, this new one was hungrier than a pack of men, the stink of gas and newly snapped wood and oil spilling onto tile, and when the last tremor shook the wire above our heads, a long glass rod that had been balanced as if by a trick on the windowsill finally committed to falling and smashed. Somewhere down the street a baby started crying again, because when some other sound stops, you can hear the baby, and it wasn't the baby's fault that we'd forgotten it was there. My father came out with the ceramic jar, the muslin still tied over the top, his hands white with flour, which I have never been able to reconcile with the dust covering everything else. He looked like a man saved from drowning, but the pot was exactly, perfectly, whole. He put it in my mother's shopping basket like it was a saint. He kissed my sister's head and my mother's cheek and then he looked up the street, toward the hill, and then down, toward the waterfront, and then at me. Shoes, he said, because I was still barefoot. My mother pressed the basket into my belly and we ran up the stairs again, through the tilted hall that suddenly smelled of other people's breakfasts and broken plumbing. My chest was full of rattling birds. I had to stop and turn to cough, and when I did I saw, through the window at the bend in the stair, a pillar of smoke starred itself like a wayward thought above a roof 3 streets over. The morning light was coming, pale and innocent, pretending it hadn't noticed anything. We came out with shoes and coats and my mother's hairpins and the family picture of my mother's mother that nobody could ever decide actually looked like her or not. There were already people moving up the street with parcels and blankets, holding them the way you hold a sleeping child, careful not to wake it. The telegraph poles were still drunk, but someone had tied a notice to the closest one with string and the letters danced. Since then I have thought I read the words "Help us God," but that may have been the memory my mind tied on afterwards. People had already, without talking, decided which things they would not leave behind. The man with the gamecocks had them both in a single cage, and their heads peered out, calm like bishops. Mrs. Herrera from the corner had the statue of the Virgin wrapped in a dish towel and held so the face looked out, watching with her painted mercy across the gutter, which, at that moment, was flowing like a creek with somebody's spilled rice. A man from the fire brigade was running, and he shouted, "Gas! Turn off your gas," even though we had already smelled it, and people started to reach for their meters. The quake had torn the city along seams none of us knew were there. When you live in a thing, you think you know it. We didn't. We learned it by its breaking. The first fire we saw caught in a building with a paint shop on the ground floor, and it went up the way paint has always wanted to go up, as if it had been waiting for the excuse. We watched the orange growl at the window, like a mean dog testing a fence. The firemen got there fast, thrashing their foaming horses to a stop, and they ran a hose to the hydrant and the man with the big wrench bent his whole body to it, and then men along the line lifted the hose with their backs and called to one another, and the chief set his hand near the mouth of the hose to test the pressure, and he swore in a thin voice you could barely hear because there wasn't enough water. The hydrant coughed like an old man. I will tell you this, I would rather see a building burn than a fireman have to stand with an empty hose while a flame licks out the window and offers you its teeth. Men are built to fight. There was nothing to hit. We go uphill, my father said. Pack. We had thought the world had broken once, and it would be done with us, but the next aftershock came, smaller, like a mean little cousin, and while people clutched their door frames and some of them laughed because if you don't laugh, your mouth will fill with the wrong kind of salt, more smoke went up, and the horses blew the whites of their eyes and pranced sideways, and a bell started ringing, not because someone rang it, but because the rope had gotten itself tangled around somebody's ankle. And he was too busy to unknot it? The streetcar tracks had lifted themselves slightly, and they stood like the ribs of a gut-stripped fish, and people stepped over them like children afraid of cracks. We went up and up, toward Washington Square, and the smoke followed us, not as fast as our legs but faster than anyone could think, because it had the whole city to feed on. The pockets of gas that had been asleep under the streets woke and breathed, broken chimneys coughed sparks into bedding, lamps clattered and broke and offered their flame to curtains, and it was the hour when cooks light their stoves. I do not blame anyone. We did not build it to go down. The church at the square had not fallen entirely, its towers had listed to one side like a man with sore hips. People were moving into the green, carrying feather beds and picture frames and soup pots. A man had a piano on a handcart and the legs were splayed, but he pushed the thing like it was a necessary kind of foolishness, and when he got it to the grass he sat on the stool and hit a bang out of it, and people laughed and someone told him to hush, but for a minute he was as much a hero as any man with a helmet. In the center of the square a water cistern sat under a steel hatch, and someone with a map of such things they existed, it turns out, and none of us had known had already turned its wheel and dipped the first buckets, and a line formed without anyone calling for a line, because we are better at order than we admit, as long as what is needed is plain. We drank and grimaced at the metallic taste and then used the rest to splash over our bandanas and tie them over our noses for the smoke. My sister, who had found her voice again, asked 100 times in the tone children use when they already know the answer and are daring you to lie, "Are we leaving? Is the house burned?" My mother didn't answer. She brushed plaster out of my sister's hair as if she were grooming a pony. Above the clatter and the cough, a horn bleated, odd and nasal, not animal. Everyone turned. A motor car rolled into the square, ungainly as a beetle, and the driver leaned out and shouted something about the Presidio and shelters. He wore a cap with a stiff brim and looked pleased with himself the way people who have the newest thing do, even when the newest thing is leaking water because he had driven through a burst main. He pulled to the curb and stalled it, and then could not get it going again. A soldier leaned off the side and kicked the wheel like it had insulted his mother. The horn gave a weak little squeak. If you want to know how to make a city laugh during a hard hour, arrive with a motor car that cannot restart. It was a dim sort of laughter, though, and the smoke pulled long fingers into the square. "We go farther," my father said. "To the park," he added, and though we were not a family that took long walks in the park like some of the fine folks up around Nob Hill, I had been there enough to know it was a place where the earth spread itself out, where you could lie down and not worry about a roof. My father looked toward the water, toward the north, but the smoke was thick as stew that way already, and from down toward the ferry building there was a rumble that sounded like barrels rolling off a truck forever, and someone said, "Dynamite," as if it were a friend who had suddenly shown up late to the party and now might make it interesting. We went west. We joined a slow stream of people as different from each other as you would suppose women with uptown hats and corsets too tight for walking who were too proud to loosen them in public, sailors still smelling of tar and salt who carried children with their hairy arms as gentle as you like, Chinese men with their shoulders under poles that balanced boxes and bedding such that they walked like boats across crowded water, a black barber from down on Stockton who kept patting the breast of his waistcoat as if the scissors in the pocket might jump out and run away on him. A priest walked with his stole looped and a calm mouth, and a young nurse with a red cross band around her sleeve like an armband had a bag that clinked. In a doorway a woman saw the line we made and turned back into her apartment and came out with a loaf of bread in each hand and began to slice and pass, and when the slices ran out, she tore, and when they tore uneven, she did not make apologies. The park, when we got to it, had already done its trick of being somewhere you recognize and somewhere you don't. The eucalyptus trees, which are not even from here, did that thing they do where they shed great curls of bark as if they have had enough of one kind of clothing and will be wearing another from now on, and the shed pieces were soft and smelled peppery and raisinous, and the grass was damp with the morning and a little ash. A group of boys had found a kite in an abandoned cart and they had ripped away the broken string and tied new string to the crossbars and were sending it up into an orange sky as if they were making a new sun, which is the job of boys sometimes. Dogs ran, mad with the excitement of being allowed in places they were usually not permitted to be. A soldier with a thin, sharp face stood on a bench and tried to get everyone's attention with a whistle and some authority, and after 3 tries, he did. "Hear me," he called, and we did. "There will be ovens built here. There will be bread lines. There will be a field hospital at the third meadow by the windmill. Water will be fetched and stored. Evacuation by ferry for those who wish to go will be organized down by the Lincoln Park side. Who can cook? Who can haul? Who can bandage? Line up here, here, and here." He pointed with a quick, schoolteacher hand. He couldn't have been more than 20. My father didn't need the lines to tell him. A man who makes bread needs an oven and flour and water and heat. One of those we had. The rest had to be arrived at. He put my sister down on our folded blanket and knelt in front of us so he was eye level with me. "Watch your mother," he said. "I will come back. Do not go wandering to see the fire." He looked at me hard as if he were hammering a nail out of my thick head. I wanted to say, "I'm not a baby," but knew as the pretty words for it were, my chest was full of fear I didn't want him to see, and I nodded instead. The aftershock that came then was more a persuasion than a threat, a little jolt like you give a friend to make them laugh, but the ground hummed under my feet, and I felt as if a horse had breathed on the back of my neck. He touched my hair, which usually I would have ducked, and then he stood and went to find an officer, any officer, who could tell him where he ought to put his hands. We slept that first night on the grass with our shoes on and our coats buttoned and with the sounds of strangers as our lullaby, and if you think that sounds romantic, you have never tried to sleep with the end of your braid tickling the back of your neck and with your belly empty and with somebody nearby snoring like a saw. The fires went up in orange towers, and the sky wore their clothes. Sparks landed in our hair and smoldered out, and after hours of the sound of big things failing, things too big to feel like they might ever fail, buildings throwing up their roofs, walls letting go of their corners, streets that had always gone one way suddenly going another with the lifting of tracks, the sound of footsteps in the grass and murmured talk and the occasional cry of a child whom this particular hour had finally overfilled were plain and almost soothing. Someone had dragged a piano even here, and a lanky boy was playing, careful as if the keys might break, and some of the notes were missing, and the song he chose was a march that made me think of men walking in step to nowhere. There was a smell of beef bones from a big pot, and the peppery eucalyptus and the salt from the ocean and the tired wool of coats, and under all that, faint as a grandmother's perfume, the yeast from the jar in my mother's basket. If you tell me scent cannot anchor you, I will think you have never been lost. In the morning, the army had made ovens, as if they had carried bricks and mortar in their pockets. They built them of stacked brick with iron doors fashioned from anything that would not melt, and the first one I saw had a lid that had been a scrap of a sign from outside a billiards hall. There were tables of bread in the later days, loaves lined like troops at muster, but that first morning there were biscuits, hard and white and hot, and when the soldier who had a pencil behind his ear handed one to my sister, she said, "Thank you, sir," with a solemnity that made him smile without his mouth moving. My father, who had found a friend from a bakery on Stockton, stood with his back to a pile of sacks of flour that someone had rescued from a warehouse and was telling the young soldiers how much heat was enough, and when one of them said, "How do you know?" my father answered by flicking his fingers into the oven's air as if he were a fortune teller and saying, "Because I have burned my hands many times," and the soldiers laughed and nodded because pain makes the best teacher, and they all went to school that day. I am mixing days together now because that is how it felt then, like time was a dough we kept folding and making new layers out of. We woke and ate and folded blankets and went to carry water, and we came back and carried bricks and came back and looked for someone or waited to see if someone would find us. We moved across the grass to get into shade or into sun or away from the smoke that came up when the wind changed its mind. It is not a clean line, tragedy, it wanders like a stubborn river. On the second day, I think it was, the wind pushed the fire toward us, and we could see the long radiance of it through the trunks of the trees like the light in a cathedral, and a man ran up the hill and said that the dynamiters had cut a line down at Van Ness, and another said that they had. People spoke in pieces of rumor as if each rumor were a plank, and if you put enough together, you could make a bridge, and sometimes you could. We went down to the edge of the park once, my father and I, after we loaded a handcart with chipped bricks. The cart belonged to a man with a mustache and a girl who rode the edge of it like it was a carnival, because if you are 9 you can find a small happiness in the corner of any big sadness, and that is a grace. We took the cart to the end of the street where the pavement bulged, and then we went a little farther, and then my father said, "Enough," because even a boy could see that there was a line between seeing and seeing too much. The buildings in that direction were not buildings anymore in the polite sense, they were glowing makers of wind. The heat slapped the hairs on my arms. The only sounds were the deep vowels of burning and the occasional bang of something inside a building that remembered itself and wanted to explode. Off to the side, in a tiny patch of unburned sidewalk, a china teacup sat upright, somehow unbroken, shining like a joke. I wanted to take it, for the feeling of luck, but I knew if I bent down to pick it up, my hair might catch fire with my head still in it. We went back into the slower air and breathed like people come out of a tunnel. The night after that, a troop of soldiers came through the camp, quiet, with rifles on their shoulders, and people got to their feet with the suddenness you have when you hear an unexpected knock after midnight. The soldiers weren't there for trouble, they were there to take account, to make sure we were here, to tell us what was planned. You could hear the men's boots on the damp grass, a soft drum. One of them paused near us and squinted into my face. He had a kind mouth. He said, "You look like the boys I grew up with in Nebraska," though I did not know where Nebraska was at the time, only that it was a word you could talk around in your mouth and feel the points of it. "I look like San Francisco," I said, which made him smile. He asked my name Luca, I told him, and my father's, and he wrote them in a little notebook with a stub of pencil like he was buying meat. Somewhere in a city already half burned, there was still the idea of a list. There were losses we knew and losses that were delayed, like seeds waiting for rain. The Herreras were not at the park, and it took 3 days before we heard they had gone by ferry to Oakland with a cousin. Mr. Sullivan, when he finally found me and clapped my back and split my whole breath in two, had smudged the numbers on his ledger so badly you would have thought it had been a book of psalms that he had kept near his heart in times of danger. An old man who made shoes in a basement shop along our street, a quiet man with a mustache you could imagine him trimming nightly with a tiny comb, had gone down into his cellar to retrieve his awls and his leather, and the stair had failed him, and he had broken a bone, and the men next door had fetched him out and made a stretcher of 2 broom handles and a length of carpet, and now he sat on the grass in a neat hat with his legs splinted and his mouth politely shut against complaint, as if he had no right to make his pain the center of the world. The Chinese family who had a laundry 2 doors down from us, Mr. Wang and his sister, who always kept the front clean and quiet, came to our fire the 3rd night with a tin of tea and a small jar of sugar and bowed a little like they were handing round the last of their treasure, which they were. We had a tin pot. My mother said, "Let me do it," and lit the twig ends with a careful match and boiled water and rinsed the cups the way she had seen Mrs. Wang do it in the old days, as if a ghost of regular life could be called by doing a thing the ordinary way. There was a little girl between them, and she had a doll whose smile had been rubbed off, and she and my sister sat together and poured pretend tea for each other between real sips and whispered in the language that children use, which is not yours and does not need to be. Some old things were postponed, not ended. My father and I went into the city with a crew to lift bricks out of piles and stack them, and if that does not sound like a thing you would do, I will tell you that you can learn to love the rhythm of your hands if your hands are what you have. We chipped crunch the old mortar away with a hammer, and we made stacks as neat as if they were worth more than they were, which somehow made them worth more. My father had a way of picking up a brick and weighing it in his hand that made him look like he could weigh the world and tell you how much you owed on it. We worked with two men from North Beach and an American-born soldier whose accent was Kansas and a woman who tied the end of her scarf under her hair and pulled with the strength of a man who lifts barrels for livelihood. There was laughter over the little things, over the girl in the busted shirtwaist who flirted with the soldier as if the world were a dance hall and not a red gloom, over the way the donkey the man with the mustache had brought there practically sneered when anyone called him sweetheart. The donkey's name was Max. If he had been a person, he would have never said please. You could see a building drop from 3 blocks away and not see it at all, if the smoke was thick. You could stand on a hill and try to count the bell towers that were still themselves and give up after a time because you didn't want to be wrong. The ferry building's clock stood, and the hands, I was told, had stayed at some number that later would matter to someone who needed meaning, but that morning I only needed direction. The enormous Palace Hotel threw orange sheets out its windows and became a lantern, and the sound of its floors giving way clapped the air like thunder. City Hall was a cracked egg. The Mint hunkered down like a stubborn mule, and someone later told me it had survived because some brave men had stood with hoses and buckets, and because its walls were good, which is a thing we should be careful to say about ourselves but often cannot. We went down to the ferry building once, my mother and I, to see if there were letters posted. People started pinning up notes written in pencil on scraps of butcher paper and torn envelopes, messages for those who might come by later. We are in Golden Gate Park near Windmill. We are at my Aunt Maria's in Oakland. Looking for Charlie Lee. A woman had a baby in a blanket at her chest, and the baby was quiet as a loaf of bread, and that is less strange than you might think. The ferry bell rang, and people pressed in, beginning to surge, and then the soldier with the kind mouth and the Nebraska voice and others like him put their hands up, palms open, and talked without shouting, and the surge smoothed. The clock on the tower looked down with its round face and its patient black hands and said a thing that wasn't really a thing but might as well have been, it will be later soon enough. The city settled into a strange habit, like a dog learning a new trick. Tents went up in neat rows. They were army canvas and smelled of damp and old mess. There was a place for wood and a place for water and a place where women lined up to pretend to be angry that they had to take one blanket between 4 when they were relieved to have one at all. There were rules about fires, yes here, no there, and a soldier with a whistle who would appear like a ghost if you tried to light a pipe where you were not supposed to. The windmills there toward the ocean did their work turning wind into something useful, and we could hear them when we lay our heads on our coat bundles, the steady chuff-chuff, and for the first time since the world had untied itself, the steady sound felt like a parent hand on your back. There were schools in tents, if you can imagine that. There was a woman with her hair pinned with authority and her sleeves rolled up who stood at a chalkboard propped on a crate and said, "We will be reading from memory today," and the children laughed because that's exactly the kind of thing to say in a city where everything had been thrown up into the air and had not yet landed again. We learned letters on slates, and I wrote my name with a stub of soapstone and watched the powder of it fall to the rough planks as if the letters themselves were made of dust. I did not have good penmanship, but I could make a loaf that would not split on the bottom, and the teacher was kind and did not make me feel as if one mattered more than the other. We practiced copying notices, because there were notices everywhere: do not touch fallen wires. Boiled water only. Bread line here at 7 and 5. No one said the thing you wanted to see on a notice more than any other thing, which was your own name followed by the word safe. My father took to walking the edges of the park mornings and evenings, to watch and to eat the watching. He would come back and say, "They have begun to rebuild on 16th, like he was announcing the first sprout in a field. He would say, "They have put a pump at Dolores that works," and people would murmur at the wonder of water coming when you call it. One evening he came back with a bag of nails over his shoulder, and his smile was the shy smile of a man who has to ask for something for himself. He said, "They have asked for men to build the cottages," and I did not understand until he said, "For us," and I thought, then, that we were already living in a cottage under a sky roof made by God, but he meant little houses that would become city if you put enough together. Relief cottages, they called them. Shacks, other people called them. I have slept in a mansion made of wood and in a bed that had been a crate, and I can tell you, any house you can warm with laughter and bread is grand enough. He built ours with 3 other men and with me doing the small jobs and then the bigger ones under their eyes. The wood was new and splintery, and the saw made a sound like a stubbornness being overcome. The hammer handle felt right in my palm, as if it had been made for me and not for the last boy to hold it, which is a feeling you want at 12. There was a smell of pine sap, and the sound of men calling measurements, and someone sang a song about a girl and a mountain that was silly and rude and meant to be, and the laugh it got made the nails hold. We painted it the color that the city gave us, which was a green that did not match any green in nature, and when the first coat went up, a little wind came off the ocean and smelled of salt and tar and fish, and it pushed itself into the new walls, and I swear to you it stood up straighter. We put the stove in the corner, and my father looked at the space where the oven would go like a man eyes a corner where he will plant his best tree. We were not heroes. We did the thing in front of us. We stacked, we carried, we unclipped laundry, we clipped laundry again. We showed the army how to feed top of the oven heat to the biscuits, and they showed us how to line up men who did not have the habit. We met people we would have crossed streets to avoid in the old city and now greeted with a nod like cousins. We told stories. They were the same stories over and over until they weren't, and new ones were born. "Did you hear about the hydrant near the mission that still ran?" someone would say, and we would make room in our pockets for that luck, and then someone would say, "My father saw it, and sometimes he had and sometimes he hadn't, and it did not matter, because we needed that little miracle." Miss Wong, who had come with the tea in the early days, found me one afternoon when the smoke had gone from fierce to far off and tapped my arm with a bundle of cloth. "For you," she said, and she laid it on my hands, and when I unwrapped it, it was a small bag of flour and a handful of raisins, no more than a cup, and the weight of it pressed every thank you in me upward at once. I felt like crying and didn't want to in front of her, so I held it in my chest like I could hold back the ocean with my ribs. We soaked the raisins and used the flour to wake a loaf from our mother jar, and my father turned it like an infant and slashed it just so, and when it came out of the oven in the relief kitchen, the whole thing browned and singing like a living thing. The smell was San Francisco before the break, and San Francisco after, both at once. We took it to the Wong's tent and broke it in our hands and passed it, and when Mr. Wong's sister put a piece to her lips, she closed her eyes, and I will not say she prayed, because I